I arrived at Wonderland Amusement Park 40 minutes late for my first overnight security shift. My beat-up Honda chugged and sputtered through the empty parking lot, the headlights cutting across the vacant spaces where hundreds of cars would normally sit during operating hours. The place looked completely different at night. All those bright, cheerful rides I'd seen when I'd come for my interview stood as dark outlines against the cloudy night sky, metal skeletons waiting for morning to bring them back to life. "Great first impression, Miller," I muttered to myself as I parked near the employee entrance. I checked my phone. 10:40 p.m. The shift had started at 10. I hurried toward the main office building, my footsteps crunching on the asphalt. The sound seemed too loud in the empty park. I'd never realized how much background noise people created until they weren't there anymore. Now all I heard was the distant hum of the highway beyond the fence and the occasional creak of metal as rides cooled in the night air. The office lights were still on, which I took as a good sign. Maybe whoever was waiting wouldn't be too pissed about my tardiness. I pushed open the door to find a woman sitting behind the front desk, her expression making it clear that my hopes were misplaced. "You must be James Miller," she said, not bothering to stand. "You're 40 minutes late." "Yeah, sorry about that. My car—" "I don't need excuses," she cut me off. "I'm Vera Martinez, HR manager. I handle night security staffing." Vera looked to be in her late 30s, with dark hair pulled back tight and the no-nonsense posture of someone who didn't have time for bullshit. Her stern expression made me feel like I was back in high school, getting called to the principal's office. "It won't happen again," I said. "It better not." She stood up and grabbed a folded uniform from the desk. "Here, put this on. The bathroom's down the hall." I took the dark blue uniform and did as I was told. When I returned, Vera had a set of keys and a typed sheet of paper waiting. "Your patrol keys," she said, sliding them across the desk. "And these are the night security rules. Memorize them." I picked up the paper. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Night security rules." Below were 5 numbered items. 1. Stay inside the security booth between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Do not open the door for anyone or anything. 2. If the carousel music starts playing, turn on the radio immediately. Any station will do. 3. If you see a man carrying a red balloon, hide. Do not let him see you. 4. If a child knocks on the booth window, let them in. 5. Give the child your flashlight if they laugh. I read through the list twice, waiting for Vera to crack a smile. When she didn't, I laughed instead. "Okay, I get it. Hayes the new guy, right? This is some kind of joke?" Vera's expression didn't change. "This isn't a joke, Mr. Miller. Those rules need to be followed exactly. Come on, a man with a red balloon, giving my flashlight to a laughing kid? Who came up with this stuff?" Her dark eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my smile fade. "Your patrol route covers the main midway, the carousel area, the kiddie section, and the game alleys. You'll walk it once every hour until 3, then stay in the booth until morning. Radio check-ins happen on the hour. Any questions?" I glanced down at the rules again. "Yeah, actually. What's with these rules? Is this some kind of team-building exercise or something?" In one quick motion, Vera reached across the desk and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingers digging into my skin. "Listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Follow those rules exactly if you want to stay safe. This isn't a game. This isn't a joke. Do you understand?" The sudden change in her demeanor sent a chill through me. Her eyes never left mine, and I saw something in them I couldn't quite place. Fear, concern, whatever it was, it seemed genuine. "Yeah, okay, I understand," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She let go of my wrist and straightened up. "Good. Let me show you to the security booth." We walked through the silent park, our footsteps the only sound as we passed shuttered food stands and covered game booths. The huge Ferris wheel towered overhead, its empty cars swaying slightly in the breeze. I tried to make small talk, but Vera only responded with brief, clipped answers, her eyes constantly scanning the shadows between rides. The security booth sat near the center of the park, a small structure no bigger than a garden shed with windows on all sides. Inside was a desk with a radio, a small TV monitor showing camera feeds, a coffee maker, and a worn office chair that had seen better days. "This is it," Vera said, flicking on the lights. "Radio's here. Flashlights in the drawer. First patrol starts at 11. Any questions?" I wanted to ask about a dozen things, mainly about those weird rules, but something told me Vera wasn't going to give me any real answers. "No, I think I'm good." Then I'll leave you to it." She stepped back toward the door, then paused. "Remember what I said about the rules, Mr. Miller." And just like that, she was gone, leaving me alone in the small booth with nothing but the hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead and the typed rules in my hand. I sat down in the chair, which creaked under my weight, and looked around at what would be my home for the next 8 hours. The booth smelled like stale coffee and the pine-scented cleaner that barely masked it. Through the windows, I could see dark pathways stretching out in all directions, disappearing between silent rides and empty attractions. I read through the rules one more time, still half convinced they were some weird joke the staff played on newcomers. But Vera's intensity when she'd grabbed my wrist, that hadn't seemed like someone playing a prank. My watch read 10:55 p.m., 5 minutes until my first patrol. I put the rules sheet on the desk and picked up the flashlight from the drawer, testing its weight and beam. It was a heavy-duty model with a bright light that cut sharply through the darkness outside the window. What the hell have I gotten myself into? I wondered aloud to the empty booth. Only the distant sound of the highway answered back. I completed my second patrol at midnight without anything strange happening. The park remained exactly what you'd expect after hours. Quiet, dark, and honestly kind of boring. Each time I walked past a closed food stand or silent ride, I kept thinking about those weird rules Vera had given me. They seemed more ridiculous with each passing minute. After checking in on the radio at midnight, I took a 15-minute break in the security booth. I drank some lukewarm coffee from the ancient pot on the counter and tried to stay awake. The TV monitor showed nothing but empty pathways and motionless rides from its rotating camera feeds. The most exciting thing I'd seen all night was a raccoon digging through a trash can near the funnel cake stand. At 12:15, I grabbed my flashlight and headed out for my third round. The night had gotten cooler, and I pulled my uniform jacket tighter around me. October nights got chilly in this part of the country, and the breeze cut right through the thin material. Should have worn a better jacket, I muttered to myself as I walked down the main midway. My footsteps echoed off the metal game booths and shuttered food stands. Everything looked different at night, not just darker, but somehow smaller and more worn out. During the day, the bright colors and flashing lights distracted from the peeling paint and rusted metal. Now, my flashlight beam picked out every flaw. The Ferris wheel stood in the center of the park, taller than anything else around it. It looked like a sleeping giant against the night sky, its empty passenger cars rocking gently in the breeze. The metal creaked occasionally, making me jump the first couple times I heard it. I just passed the wheel when I heard something that didn't belong. Music. Not just any music, but the tinkling, cheerful notes of a carnival melody. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere ahead of me. I stopped walking and listened harder. The tune was familiar, the kind of music you'd hear on a carousel or merry-go-round, but all the rides were shut down for the night. "Hello?" I called out, immediately feeling stupid. "Anyone there?" No answer except the continuing melody, drifting through the empty park. I pointed my flashlight beam ahead and started walking faster, following the music. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the carousel, which made a weird kind of sense. But who would turn it on at nearly 1 in the morning? The path took me past rows of game booths, ring toss, balloon darts, basketball shots, all dark and silent. My light bounced off prizes still hanging from their hooks, giant stuffed animals, plastic toys, and cheap electronics that probably didn't even work. As I got closer to the carousel area, the music grew slightly louder. I picked up my pace, moving between 2 food stands and around a cotton candy booth. The moment I turned the corner and the carousel came into view, the music stopped. The sudden silence hit me like a physical thing. 1 second, cheerful carnival notes. The next, nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of highway traffic beyond the park. The carousel stood completely still, its painted horses frozen mid-gallop in the beam of my flashlight. The control booth was dark, and nothing looked disturbed or out of place. "What the hell?" I whispered. I walked closer, playing my light across the ride. The horses stared back with glassy eyes, their wooden bodies dulled by years of use and repainting. No sign that anything had been operating moments ago. I checked my watch. 12:47. Still hours before that weird 3 a.m. rule would kick in. Was this connected to those rules somehow? The paper had mentioned carousel music specifically. I pulled out my radio and pressed the talk button. "Security booth, this is Miller. I just heard music coming from the carousel area. Over." I released the button and waited for a response. Nothing came back but harsh static. "Security booth, do you copy? This is Miller reporting possible activity near the carousel. Over. More static. I frowned and tapped the radio against my palm a couple times before trying again. Still nothing but crackling noise. Great, I muttered, hooking the radio back onto my belt. Probably too far from the main office. A loud metallic clang made me spin around. The sound had come from across the midway, where the funhouse stood with its garish painted entrance. The noise had been sharp and distinct, like something heavy falling onto a metal floor. I raised my flashlight, its beam barely reaching the funhouse entrance. "Hey, anyone over there?" I called out. The only answer was a sound that made my skin go cold. Children laughing. Not one child, but several, their high-pitched giggles floating across the empty midway. It lasted only a few seconds, then faded away. I swallowed hard, my hand tightening around the flashlight. Kids weren't allowed in the park after closing. Hell, nobody was supposed to be here except security. "This isn't funny," I shouted, trying to sound authoritative instead of freaked out. "The park is closed. You need to leave immediately." No response. Part of me wanted to turn around and head straight back to the security booth. But that was the job, right? Checking out strange noises and kicking out trespassers. I took a deep breath and started walking toward the funhouse. The structure loomed ahead, its entrance shaped like a giant clown face with the door as its mouth. During the day, it probably looked cheerful in a tacky sort of way. At night, lit only by my flashlight, it looked like something from a nightmare. As I got closer, the sounds I'd heard didn't repeat. No more metallic clangs, no more laughter. The funhouse stood silent and still, its painted eyes seeming to watch me approach. I reached the entrance and shined my light inside. A short hallway led to the main attraction, with mirrors lining both sides. I could see my reflection distorted in a dozen different ways, stretched tall, squeezed short, twisted and warped. "Hello? Security here. Anyone inside needs to exit the park now." My voice echoed back at me, sounding smaller than I'd intended. I took a cautious step into the entrance hall, my flashlight beam bouncing off the mirrors and multiplying into confusing patterns of light. The sound of my own footsteps seemed too loud in the enclosed space. I moved slowly, checking behind each turn, half expecting to find teenagers hiding or homeless people seeking shelter. But there was nobody, just empty walkways and silent machinery. After 5 minutes of searching the main areas of the funhouse and finding nothing, I backed out to the midway again. The sounds I'd heard were gone, with no explanation I could find. The park felt different now. I couldn't explain exactly how, but something had changed in the atmosphere. The air itself seemed charged with a strange energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. The shadows between rides looked deeper, the silence heavier. I found myself remembering Vera's face when she'd talked about the rules, the intensity in her eyes when she'd grabbed my wrist. Maybe those rules weren't a joke after all. I decided to head back toward the security booth. My watch showed nearly 1 a.m., and I still had the rest of my patrol route to cover before the next radio check-in. I walked faster than I meant to, my footsteps quick on the asphalt. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from the shadows. The midway stretched ahead, dark and empty. The breeze picked up, sending paper wrappers skittering across the ground and making the canvas awnings flap against their frames. Normal night sounds in an empty amusement park, nothing to worry about. But as I hurried back toward the security booth, I couldn't stop thinking about those rules. Stay inside between 3 and 6. If carousel music plays, turn on the radio. If you see a man with a red balloon, hide. For the first time since starting this job, I wondered if I should take them seriously after all. I finished my final patrol at 2:45 a.m. and headed back to the security booth. My mind kept replaying the carousel music and that weird laughter I'd heard earlier. The park felt different now, like it was waiting for something. The security booth looked even smaller as I approached it, a tiny island of light in the sea of darkness. I stepped inside, checked my watch, and saw I had 15 minutes before the 3 o'clock deadline. According to rule number 1, I needed to stay locked inside until 6 in the morning. I made a quick cup of coffee from the ancient pot, grimacing at the bitter taste. The cheap office chair groaned under my weight as I sat down to watch the monitor. The camera feeds cycled through empty pathways and silent rides. Nothing moved except occasional paper trash blowing across the ground. At exactly 3 o'clock, I stood up and locked the door, turning the deadbolt with a solid click. The sound was oddly final, like sealing myself in a vault. My hands weren't completely steady, and I wiped them on my uniform pants. "This is stupid," I said to the empty booth. "I'm locking myself in because of some dumb rules." But I remembered how the carousel music had started playing by itself, how I'd heard children laughing near the funhouse. I wasn't so sure the rules were dumb anymore. I sat back down and tried to get comfortable. The booth was stuffy and smelled like old coffee grounds and cleaning supplies. The only sounds were the hum of the small TV monitor and my own breathing. Outside, the park sat silent and dark. I checked my watch, 3:05 a.m. The minutes crawled by. I doodled on a notepad, flipped through an old magazine someone had left behind, and checked the camera feeds repeatedly. Nothing changed. The empty park remained empty. At 3:20 a.m., something broke the silence. "Help me, please, I'm lost!" I jerked upright, nearly knocking over my coffee cup. The voice came from somewhere outside, young, frightened, and completely human. I pressed my face against the window, trying to see who had called out. The darkness beyond the glass revealed nothing but the usual outlines of game booths and rides. "Hello?" I called back. "Where are you? Please!" The voice came again, closer this time. "I need help. I can't find my way out." It sounded like a teenager, maybe younger. The voice cracked with fear and desperation. I scanned the area around the booth but saw no one. I reached for the door handle, then stopped. Rule number 1 burned in my memory. Stay inside the security booth between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Do not open the door for anyone or anything. "Are you hurt?" I asked through the glass. "Where are your parents?" The voice came again, right outside the door now. "Please, I need help. I'm scared." Every instinct told me to open the door. What kind of person leaves a lost kid outside in the cold? But Vera's face flashed in my mind, the intensity in her eyes when she'd grabbed my wrist and told me to follow the rules exactly. "I can't open the door," I said, loud enough to be heard outside. "But I can call for help. What's your name?" A pause. Then, in a smaller voice, "Why won't you help me?" "I'll help you from in here," I said, reaching for the radio. "I just can't open the door right now." Another pause, longer this time. I held my breath, hoping the kid would understand. The door handle rattled violently, making me jump back. The entire door shook in its frame. "I know you're in there!" The voice had changed, deeper and angrier. "Why won't you help me?" The handle rattled again, harder this time. I backed away until I bumped into the desk. My heart hammered against my ribs as sweat broke out across my forehead. "Open the door!" The voice wasn't a child's anymore. It had dropped an octave, twisted into something wrong. "Open it now!" The door shuddered as something slammed against it. The deadbolt held, but for how long? "I can't," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm not supposed to." A laugh came from outside, not the innocent giggle of a child, but something that made my skin crawl. "You will," the voice hissed. "Eventually, you will." The pounding continued. Bang, bang, bang. Each impact shook the small booth. I grabbed the desk to steady myself, knocking the radio to the floor. The batteries popped out and rolled under the chair. For 10 agonizing minutes, the voice continued its assault, sometimes sobbing like a heartbroken child, sometimes screaming threats that made my blood run cold. The door handle twisted and turned. Something scratched at the windows, leaving faint marks on the glass. I curled up in the chair, trying to make myself as small as possible. The rules weren't a joke, they were a survival guide. At 3:35 a.m., the voice finally began to fade. The banging stopped. The handle ceased its rattling. The last thing I heard was a whispered promise. "I'll be back." Then silence. I stayed frozen in place, afraid to move. My uniform stuck to my back, soaked with sweat. My legs trembled so badly I wasn't sure they would support me if I tried to stand. I looked at my watch. 3:37 a.m. More than 2 hours until I could leave the booth. I picked up the radio from the floor, fumbled the batteries back in, and tried to call the main office. Nothing but static answered me. I was completely alone until sunrise. The rest of the night stretched before me like an endless road. I checked the windows every few minutes, jumping at shadows and creaks. The camera feeds showed nothing unusual, just empty pathways and silent rides. Whatever had been outside my door didn't appear on any screen. I counted the seconds, the minutes, the hours. Every tick of my watch marked another moment survived. By 5:30 a.m., the first hint of gray appeared in the eastern sky. The park began to emerge from darkness, shadows retreating as objects took on their familiar daytime shapes. I watched the transformation through bloodshot eyes, relief washing over me as the world became normal again. But I couldn't forget that voice. Couldn't forget how it had changed from a frightened child to something else entirely. Couldn't forget the promise it had made before disappearing into the night. The rules weren't a joke after all. I'd been staring at my watch for almost 40 minutes straight, counting every tick that brought me closer to 6 o'clock. The booth felt like a prison cell now, but at least whatever had been outside earlier was gone. My throat was dry from fear, and the coffee I'd made earlier sat cold and forgotten on the desk. At exactly 4:15, a sound cut through the silence. Music. Not just any music. The unmistakable tinkling melody of the carousel. The same music I'd heard during my patrol hours earlier. My head snapped up, and I felt my stomach drop as the cheerful notes drifted through the park. "No way," I whispered, pushing myself up from the chair. I moved to the window, pressing my face against the glass to see through the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but the usual shadows of silent rides and empty pathways. Then my eyes caught movement in the distance. The carousel was turning. Not just turning, it was in full operation. Horses rose and fell on their brass poles, their painted bodies moving in that hypnotic up and down rhythm. The colored lights along the canopy flashed in sequence, red to blue to green to yellow, casting eerie glows across the empty seats. No operator, no riders, just a fully functioning carousel spinning in the dead of night. The rules Vera had given me flashed through my mind. Rule number 2, if carousel music starts playing, turn on the radio immediately. I practically dove for the small radio on the desk, my fingers fumbling with the dial. I twisted it frantically, trying to find a station, any station. Static filled the booth, harsh and grating. I kept turning, desperation making my hands shake. Come on, I muttered, spinning the dial faster. More static. Then a brief snatch of a voice. I turned back carefully, trying to find it again. The static cleared for a moment, and suddenly the booth was filled with the opening guitar riff of Sweet Child O' Mine. I cranked the volume up as high as it would go. The music blasted through the small space, drowning out the carousel melody from outside. I backed away from the desk, eyes fixed on the window, heart pounding in my chest. Through the glass, I could still see the carousel spinning, its painted horses moving up and down in their endless circle. The lights continued to flash in sequence, but now they seemed dimmer, as if competing with the radio was draining their power. "Please work," I whispered, though I had no idea what I was even hoping for. The song played on, filling the booth with sound. I kept my eyes glued to the carousel, waiting for something to happen. Would it stop? Would something else appear? 5 minutes passed with nothing changing. The carousel kept turning, and Axl Rose kept singing about where he'd go. Then I saw movement between the game booths, something shifting in the shadows. My breath caught as a figure stepped into view, moving with a strange, gliding grace. The figure walked slowly, deliberately, toward the carousel. Even from a distance, I could see the red balloon floating above his hand, bobbing gently with each step. Rule number 3. If you see a man with a red balloon, hide. Don't let him see you. I dove for the light switch, plunging the booth into darkness. Without the interior lights, I could see more clearly outside, which meant I had a perfect view of the approaching figure. He moved wrong. That was the only way I could describe it. His steps were too even, too measured. His body didn't sway or shift like a normal person walking. He just glided forward, one foot precisely in front of the other. I dropped to the floor behind the desk, my back pressed against the wooden panel. The carpet smelled like dust and old coffee stains. I inched my way under the desk, making myself as small as possible. Through the narrow gap beneath the desk, I could see a slice of the outside world. The park's pathways, a bit of the midway, and, eventually, a pair of polished black shoes stepping into view. The shoes stopped directly in front of the booth window. They were immaculate, reflecting the carousel lights despite the darkness. Not a scuff, not a speck of dirt marred their surface. I held my breath, pressing myself deeper into the shadows under the desk. The radio continued to blast classic rock, now playing Highway to Hell, an eerily appropriate choice that might have made me laugh in different circumstances. The shoes stayed motionless for what felt like an eternity. Then a voice spoke. "I know you're hiding." The voice was smooth and cold, like silk draped over ice. It carried perfectly through the glass, cutting through even the blaring radio. "Come out and play with me." I bit down on my lip so hard I tasted blood. My lungs burned from holding my breath, but I didn't dare make a sound. My leg muscles cramped from being bunched up under the desk, but I remained frozen. The shoes pivoted slightly, as if their owner was looking directly at the spot where I hid. "I can wait," the voice said. "I have all night. You have to come out eventually." I squeezed my eyes shut, silently begging for this to end. The cramp in my leg worsened, sending shooting pains up my thigh. Sweat trickled down my back, soaking my uniform shirt for the second time tonight. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The radio moved on to another song, then another. My watch ticked away the seconds, but I couldn't risk looking at it. Finally, after what must have been 10 minutes of pure terror, the shoes turned away. They moved with that same unnatural precision, step by perfect step, back toward the midway. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I watched through the gap as the polished shoes grew smaller with distance, finally disappearing from my limited view. The carousel music stopped abruptly. The park plunged into silence aside from the radio, which continued to play "Don't Fear the Reaper" at full volume. Somehow, that particular song didn't make me feel any better. I stayed under the desk for another 5 minutes, afraid to trust that he was really gone. When I finally gathered the courage to peek out, the carousel stood motionless once again, its lights dark, its horses frozen mid-gallop. No sign remained of the man or his red balloon. On shaking legs, I crawled out from under the desk and collapsed into the chair. Every muscle in my body ached from being tensed for so long. I reached out and turned down the radio volume, but didn't shut it off completely, just in case. I checked my watch, 4:30. Only 15 minutes had passed since the carousel started playing, though it felt like hours. I opened the desk drawer and was relieved to find a spare flashlight alongside some pens and paperwork. I tested it. The beam was strong and steady. At least I had a backup if I needed it. I stared out at the dark park, wondering what other horrors might be waiting in the shadows. 2 of the 5 rules had now proven themselves very, very real, and I still had more than an hour and a half to go. I checked my watch. 4:32 a.m. Another hour and a half to go before I could leave this booth. My muscles still ached from hiding under the desk, and my nerves felt frayed from the encounter with the man carrying the red balloon. The radio continued to play softly in the background. I'd turned it down but didn't dare shut it off completely. A soft tapping sound made me freeze. At first, I thought it might be the man with the balloon returning, but the sound was different, lighter, almost hesitant. Tap, tap, tap. I slowly turned toward the window, dreading what I might see. Instead of the polished shoes and red balloon, I found myself looking at a small boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 years old, standing outside in nothing but a thin t-shirt and jeans. His arms were wrapped tightly around his small body, and I could see his breath forming little clouds in the cold night air. His dark eyes looked directly at me through the glass as he raised one hand to knock again. Rule number 4 flashed through my mind. Let any child who knocks on the booth window inside. My first instinct was to ignore him, to pretend I hadn't seen him at all. After what happened with the voice outside earlier, I wasn't eager to open that door for anyone. But something about the boy's expression, the blank, patient look on his face as he stood shivering in the cold, made me reconsider. The other rules had protected me. Maybe this one would too. I stood up on shaky legs and moved to the door. My hand hovered over the deadbolt for a moment before I finally turned it with a solid click. The sound felt incredibly loud in the quiet booth. I pulled the door open, letting in a rush of cold air. "Hey there," I said, my voice rough from hours of silence. "You should come inside where it's warm." The boy didn't respond. He just walked past me into the booth, his movements stiff from the cold. I closed and locked the door behind him, not wanting to leave it open for even a second longer than necessary. The child walked to the corner of the small room and sat down on the floor, his back against the wall. His dark eyes remained fixed on the floor, and his face showed no emotion, no relief at being out of the cold, no fear, no curiosity, nothing. "Are you okay?" I asked, keeping my distance. Something about him felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. "What's your name? Where are your parents?" He didn't answer. He didn't even look up. "How did you get into the park?" I tried again. "It's closed. The gates are locked." Still nothing. Just that blank stare at the floor. I ran a hand through my hair, unsure what to do next. The booth felt smaller with him in it, the air somehow thicker. I glanced at the camera feeds, but they showed nothing unusual, just empty pathways and silent rides. "Are you hungry? Thirsty?" I asked. "I've got some water, and I think there might be a candy bar in my bag." The boy finally looked up at me, his face breaking into a small smile, but he remained silent, that smile fixed on his face like a mask. It didn't reach his eyes, which stayed dark and unreadable. The silence stretched between us, growing more uncomfortable by the second. I shifted in my seat, trying to think of what to do next. Call someone? But who would answer at nearly 5 in the morning? And what would I tell them? That I'd let a strange child into my security booth because a list of rules told me to. A soft sound broke the silence. The boy had begun to laugh. It started as a quiet giggle, barely audible over the low music from the radio. But it grew louder, a high-pitched sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was nothing joyful about it. It sounded practiced, mechanical, like someone imitating laughter without understanding what it meant. Rule number 5. If the child laughs, give them your flashlight. My eyes darted to the spare flashlight I'd found earlier. The child's laughter continued, filling the small space, bouncing off the windows and pressing against my ears. It made my skin crawl and my heart rate spike. I grabbed the flashlight from the desk and held it out toward him. "Here," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Take it." The boy's laughter stopped instantly, cut off as if someone had flipped a switch. His face returned to that blank expression as he stood up and walked toward me. His small hand reached out and took the flashlight, his cold fingers brushing against mine for a brief moment. The touch sent a chill through my body that had nothing to do with the temperature. The boy turned without a word and walked to the door. I hesitated, then moved to unlock it for him. He stepped outside into the darkness, the flashlight held tightly in his small hands. I closed and locked the door behind him, pressing my face against the window to watch where he went. He walked with purpose, not like a lost child, but like someone who knew exactly where they were going. The beam of the flashlight bobbed between the rides, moving away from the booth and deeper into the park. I watched until the light disappeared completely, swallowed by the darkness between the silent attractions. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands were shaking as I checked my watch. 5:18 a.m. Somehow time had jumped forward. The whole encounter had lasted nearly 45 minutes, though it felt both shorter and longer. The first hints of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, a faint lightening of the sky that promised the night would eventually end. I'd survived most of it, following the strange rules that had seemed so ridiculous at the start of my shift. The booth felt normal again, just a small security office in an empty amusement park. The radio played a song I recognized but couldn't name, the notes filling the silence left by the boy's departure. I sat back down in the chair, exhausted but too wired to relax. Outside, the park began to emerge from darkness, shadows retreating as objects took on their familiar daytime shapes. The rides that had seemed so menacing at night were transforming back into the cheerful attractions they were meant to be. As the eastern sky brightened from gray to pale blue, the park continued its transformation. The rides that had seemed like lurking monsters minutes earlier now looked ordinary, just metal and paint waiting for another day of children's laughter and cotton candy. I watched through the booth window as colors returned to the world, painting the carousel horses in their cheerful reds and blues, revealing the worn spots on the game booths that darkness had hidden. At 6 o'clock exactly, I unlocked the door with fingers that still trembled. The cool morning air hit my face as I stepped outside, carrying the smell of dew and distant asphalt rather than the stale coffee and fear that had filled the small space all night. My legs felt weak and rubbery after hours of tension, and I had to steady myself against the doorframe. I breathed deeply, filling my lungs, and looked around. Everything seemed so normal. The ride stood silent but ordinary. The paths were empty but unthreatening. If not for the damp patches of sweat still cooling on my uniform and the tremor in my hands, I might have convinced myself I'd imagined the whole night. But I hadn't. The man with the red balloon had been real. The child who took my flashlight had been real. The voice that had begged and then threatened to be let in, that had been real too. I pulled out my phone and checked the time, 6:15. My shift technically ended at 6, but I knew I couldn't leave until someone relieved me. The thought of staying even another minute made my skin crawl, but I also couldn't bring myself to abandon my post. Rules seemed important here. By 7, the maintenance crew began arriving. Men and women in gray coveralls with tool belts nodded to me as they passed, their faces showing nothing more unusual than early morning grumpiness. I watched them check rides, sweep pathways, and ready the park for the day's visitors. They moved with casual confidence, completely at ease in the space that had terrified me all night. Did they know? Had they seen things too? Or did the park's strangeness only emerge after dark? At 7:30, I spotted Vera walking toward me. She carried 2 coffee cups and wore the same crisp outfit she'd had on yesterday, her hair pulled back in that tight, professional style. Nothing in her appearance suggested she worked at a place where carousel music played itself and men with red balloons stalked the midway after dark. "Morning," she said, handing me one of the coffee cups. "You made it." I took the cup, letting its warmth seep into my cold fingers. "Barely." "How did it go?" she asked, her voice casual, as if inquiring about a routine task rather than a night of supernatural terror. "The rules," I said, staring at her. "Everything on that list." "It all happened." Vera nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. "Which ones?" "All of them. Every single one. The carousel started playing by itself. There was a man with a red balloon. A kid knocked on my window, and I gave him my flashlight when he laughed." The words tumbled out, my voice rising with each sentence. "And something tried to trick me into opening the door between 3 and 6. She didn't look surprised. She didn't even look concerned. She just nodded again, like I was reporting that I'd locked the gates or turned off the lights. "You followed the rules then," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. But what was all that? What's wrong with this place? Why didn't you warn me that all this weird stuff would actually happen?" Vera took another sip of her coffee, her eyes moving past me to scan the park. "Would you have believed me if I'd told you?" The question stopped me. Of course I wouldn't have. I'd have thought she was crazy or that it was an elaborate prank. "Probably not," I admitted. "But now that I've seen it, what's going on here? What are those things?" "Things that have always been here," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. "Long before the park was built. The rules keep everyone safe." I struggled to wrap my mind around her casual acceptance. Has anyone ever broken them? The rules, I mean. Vera's expression changed instantly. The professional mask dropped, and something cold and distant took its place. Her eyes, which had been merely serious before, now looked hollow, like she was seeing something far away, something terrible. She stared at me for what felt like minutes, but must have been only seconds. Then, without answering, she turned and walked away, her shoes clicking sharply on the pavement. "Hey!" I called after her. "What happens if someone breaks the rules?" She didn't turn around. She didn't even slow down. I stood there holding my cooling coffee, watching her disappear around a corner. That look in her eyes told me more than words could have. Whatever happened to rule breakers, it wasn't something she wanted to remember, let alone talk about. I drank the coffee as I gathered my few belongings from the booth. The caffeine did little to combat the bone-deep exhaustion that had settled over me. I'd been awake for more than 24 hours, and the constant fear had drained me completely. The walk to my car felt endless. Each step required conscious effort, my body moving on automatic pilot while my mind replayed images from the night. The carousel spinning by itself, the polished shoes of the man with the balloon, the empty eyes of the child who had taken my flashlight. By the time I reached my beat-up Honda, the morning sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across the nearly empty parking lot. I slid behind the wheel, tossed my bag onto the passenger seat, and sat there with the key in the ignition. I should quit. That thought came through with perfect clarity. I should drive away from this place and never come back. No job was worth what I'd experienced last night, no matter how well it paid. My apartment rent was due next week. I had less than $100 in my checking account. The evening manager at my last job had given me such a bad reference that I'd spent 2 months looking for work before finding this position. But it wasn't just about the money. As I sat there in my car, staring at the roller coaster that towered above the park entrance, I recognized something else mixing with the fear and exhaustion. A strange sense of accomplishment. I'd faced something impossible last night and survived. I turned the key and pulled out of the parking lot, guiding my car through the empty streets as the town began to wake up. Normal people headed to normal jobs where they wouldn't have to hide from men with red balloons or give flashlights to laughing children. My eyelids grew heavier with each mile. By the time I reached my small apartment complex, I could barely keep them open. I trudged up the stairs to my second-floor unit, fumbled with the keys, and practically fell through the door. I didn't even bother removing my uniform. I kicked off my shoes, collapsed onto my bed, and lay there staring at the ceiling, too tired to even close my eyes. The park had gotten under my skin. Those strange hours in the darkness had awakened something in me, a curiosity, a need to understand. What were those things that came out after dark? Why did the rules work? What happened to people who broke them? As sleep finally began to pull me under, one clear thought formed in my mind. I would go back tomorrow night. I would face those terrors again, would follow those strange rules, would survive another shift in that impossible place. The rules had kept me safe once. They would do it again.